The blaze marks were gone, not weathered, not grown over, scraped clean from the bark of 7 beech trees overnight, and pressed into the clay at the base of each one was a 4-toed print wide enough that I could lay my entire hand inside it, with room to spare on every side. That is how I would like to begin, if you do not mind. With the marks, not the creature, because understanding what those marks meant, and what their absence meant, is the only way any of the rest of it makes sense. My name is Elias Cord. I was 34 years old in the autumn of 1907, and I had been working as a timber cruiser in the Appalachian districts for 11 years at that point. First in the Chestnut Ridge country of Pennsylvania, then south into the Virginia coalfield margins, and finally into West Virginia proper, where the hardwood stands along the upper Guyandotte watershed were still largely untouched, and the lumber companies were moving fast to change that. A timber cruiser's work is not logging. The loggers come after. My job was to walk ahead of the crew, assess the standing timber, estimate the board-foot yield of a given tract, mark the felling boundaries with blaze cuts on the boundary trees, and keep a running tally in a field book. I was, in the language of the industry, the man who drew the lines. I want you to understand that clearly, because the lines are what this account is about. I am telling you all of this now, in October of 1913, at the request of a Mr. Harlan Fitch, who introduced himself to me as a collector of regional folklore, employed by an institution in Morgantown, whose name I will not reproduce here, because I was not given written permission to do so. Mr. Fitch found me through a former colleague who knew I had been on the Bickmore Ridge contract in 1907. He asked if I would speak on record. I agreed, with the understanding that I would be precise and that I would not speculate beyond what I observed directly. What I am about to describe happened. I do not have a theory about what it was. I have only what I saw, what I smelled, what the tally book recorded, and what I remember of the days when the book stopped being useful. You should know that I no longer work as a timber cruiser. I hold a position now with a county assessor's office in Logan, and I spend my days calculating property boundaries from survey records rather than from trees. I tell people it is quieter work. I do not tell them why I prefer it that way. The Bickmore Ridge operation was contracted through the Glenwood Timber and Stave Company out of Charleston in late September of 1907. I was brought on to cruise the Upper Ridge Tract, which the company believed held somewhere between 60 and 90,000 board feet of mature hardwood, primarily white oak, yellow poplar, and American chestnut, with a scattering of beech along the steeper north-facing slopes. The contract required me to mark the harvest boundary by October 15th, so the felling crew could begin work before the hard freeze set the ground too solid for skidding. I arrived on the ridge on October 11th and met the foreman, a man named Aldous Pruitt, for the first time at the base camp on the morning of October 12th. Pruitt deserves a careful description, because his decisions shaped everything that followed, and because I think about him still, in ways I did not expect to. He was 51 years old, Scotch-Irish by family, out of Greenbrier County, and he had been running timber operations in the Appalachians since the mid-1880s. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of economy of movement that comes from 20 years of physical work, and he carried himself with the settled authority of someone who had seen every problem the forest could produce and had solved most of them. He believed in schedules, in board-foot yields, in the arithmetic of timber. He did not believe in much else. I want to say that plainly before I describe what he became by the end, because the distance between those two versions of Aldous Pruitt is one of the things that still troubles my sleep on occasion. The crew numbered 16 men in total. I will not catalogue all of them, but there are 4 others whose presence matters to what happened. The first was a man named Cephas Doane, Pruitt's second, who handled the draft animals, 6 Belgian horses that pulled the skid sleds, and who had worked with Pruitt on 3 previous operations. Doane was a calm, taciturn man of around 40, who spoke rarely and observed everything. He was good with the horses, in the way some men are good with horses, meaning the animals read him and trusted the reading. I noticed early that when Doan was uneasy, the horses were uneasy, and the inverse was also true, which meant I paid attention to Cephas Doan as a kind of secondary instrument. The second man was named Tobias Rue, a faller from Boone County, who was the strongest man on the crew and probably the loudest. Rue had opinions about everything, and no reluctance to share them. He was not malicious, but he had the particular confidence of a man who has never yet been wrong about something in a way that truly cost him, and that confidence would become a problem before the end. The third was a company man named Stroud, whose first name I never learned, who had been sent by Glenwood to oversee the operation's record-keeping and report progress to Charleston. Stroud was young, perhaps 25, and entirely out of his element on a working ridge. He wore city shoes for the first 3 days, before Doan told him plainly that he would lose a toe to frostbite before November if he did not do something about his footwear. Stroud changed his shoes. He was not stupid, just inexperienced. And then there were the brothers. Harmon and Cleet Burl, from a family that had worked this specific stretch of Raleigh County for 2 generations. They had been hired as local guides and general labor because Pruitt believed, correctly, that local knowledge was worth paying for in unfamiliar terrain. Harmon was the older by perhaps 2 years, dark-complexioned, sparse with words, and careful about where he stepped on the ridge, in a way that the other men interpreted as nervousness, but that I came to understand was actually something closer to respect. Cleet was younger and rounder and more willing to talk, though what he said was often difficult to follow, because he spoke in the particular compressed idiom of the Hollow families, where 6 words did the work of 20, and the 20 were assumed to be understood by anyone worth talking to. The Burl brothers said something on the second day that I recorded in my tally book and that I will return to in due course. I will only say now that when they said it, the temperature in the camp seemed to drop by several degrees, and every man present found somewhere else to look, which is a specific kind of human reaction I have always found more honest than disagreement. My first week on the ridge went according to schedule. The timber was as good as the company had hoped. Perhaps better. The upper ridge tract held mature white oak that ran to 24 inches diameter, breast high in places, and the chestnut along the southern slope was largely clear of any blight signs, which in 1907 we still did not fully understand was coming for every chestnut on the eastern seaboard. I worked ahead of the crew each morning, cruising a section of perhaps 30 to 40 acres per day, marking boundary trees with a standard blaze cut, a palm-sized strip of bark removed with my cruising axe to expose the white wood beneath, and recording my board-foot estimates in the tally book. By the evening of October 17th, I had marked the entire southern and western boundary of the harvest area, and was working my way along the upper ridge spine, which ran roughly northeast to southwest at an elevation of approximately 2,600 feet. The ridge was beautiful in the way that high Appalachian terrain in late October is always beautiful, which is to say, it was cold and sharp, and the light came through the bare hardwoods at an angle that made everything look slightly more real than real life generally manages. The draft horses skidded the first felled trees down on October 16th, and by the 18th, the crew had established a rhythm, and the camp had the feeling of a working operation rather than a temporary bivouac. Pruitt ran a tight camp. Meals at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, tools accounted for at day's end, no drinking during the work week. The men grumbled about the drinking rule in the way men grumble about rules that they intend to follow anyway. I want to tell you about October 22nd because that is the day I found the first sign, though I did not understand it as a sign at the time. I filed it as an anomaly and moved on, which is perhaps what any reasonable man would have done, but which I have since revisited many times. I was working along the northeastern end of the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile above the main camp, in a section of old-growth beech that stood close together and blocked most of the morning light. I had blazed 7 trees the previous afternoon, along a line that followed the natural contour of the ridge. Standard work. When I returned to that section at around 8 in the morning to continue from where I had stopped, I found that the blaze marks were gone. I do not mean that they had faded, or that I had misidentified the trees. The white exposed wood I had cut was gone. The bark had been pressed back against the tree, smoothly, not torn or scored the way a bear's claws would leave it. It was as though the bark had been folded back and held until it took the impression of the wood beneath, which is not something bark does, not on beach, not at any temperature I have worked in. The trees looked, from 10 feet away, as though I had never touched them. Only from very close, with my hand against the surface, could I feel the slight irregularity in the grain where the mark had been. At the base of each of the 7 trees, pressed into the soft clay that the overnight rain had softened, were the prints. 4 toes on each, no claw drag visible. With a pad width I measured at 9 inches across, using the span of my hand as reference. The depth of the impressions told me the animal's weight was considerable. I pushed my thumb into the clay beside one of the prints to compare resistance, and the print was pressed to roughly 2.5 inches where mine went perhaps half an inch under full pressure. That is a substantial differential. I noted all of this in the tally book. I did not yet note the word that was forming somewhere behind my professional assessment, the word I was declining to write. I reblazed the trees, finished my morning cruise, and came back to camp at midday and reported the anomaly to Pruitt. He listened with the patient expression of a man who is waiting for the part of your sentence that will require a response. When I finished, he said bear, in the way that a man says a word that closes a conversation rather than opens one. I did not argue. Cephas Doane was nearby, tending to the horses, and I noticed that he had gone still in the way he went still, when he was listening carefully to something, but he did not say anything either. That evening, the Burl brothers were sitting at the far end of the camp, near the supply tent, and I walked over with my coffee and sat near them. I asked Harmon directly if he had seen bear sign on the upper ridge. He looked at me for a long time before answering, which is itself an answer of a kind. He said that what I had described was not bear sign. He said it in a way that suggested he knew what it was and had no intention of telling me unless I asked the specific question, which I did. He looked at his brother. Cleet looked at the fire. Then Harmon said a word I had not heard before, which I am reproducing here phonetically, as best as I can manage. Squatch. He said it once, quietly, and the effect it had on the air around that fire was something I cannot fully account for in clinical terms. Tobias Rue, who had been eating 30 feet away and could not possibly have heard the word clearly, stopped eating and looked over. Stroud, the company man, had been writing in his ledger and set down his pencil. I do not know what any of them heard, if they heard anything, but something in the quality of that moment changed. I asked Harmon what he meant by the word. He said it had lived on this ridge, on the upper ridge specifically, longer than his family had farmed the hollow below it, and that his father had told him to never blaze a tree above the second saddle without leaving the marks alone for 3 days first. 3 days, he said, so the ridge knew what you were about. His exact phrasing was so the ridge has time to reckon with your intentions. I wrote that down as he said it. He added that they had always observed that rule, and that they had always finished their seasons. I asked him what happened to men who did not observe the rule. He looked at the fire and said they did not finish their seasons. I reported this conversation to Pruitt the following morning, with as much neutrality as I could maintain. Pruitt's response was measured and unsurprising. He said that local superstition was a consistent feature of any Appalachian timber operation, that it generally corresponded to old property disputes or family grudges dressed up in folklore, and that we had a contract to complete. He was not unkind about it. He simply did not have a category in his mind for what the Burl brothers were suggesting, and a man like Pruitt had not survived 20 years in the timber business by expanding his categories unnecessarily. The felling continued. I continued marking boundaries. I will say honestly that I watched those boundaries carefully after October 22nd, and through the 23rd and 24th I found them undisturbed. By the evening of the 24th, I had begun to half believe my own note about bear sign, which is to say, I had begun to let the explanation I distrusted replace the one I feared. Then came the smell. I have been asked twice since 1907 to describe it, and both times I found that the straightforward description is the most accurate one. It was wet wool, the smell of a sheep pen in rain, but underneath that was something mineral and acrid that I can only compare to the smell of struck sulfur match, that specific combination of rotten eggs and heat that sulfur produces when it burns. On its own, either component would have been unpleasant. Together, they produced something that the body reacted to before the mind caught up, a tightening in the chest, a dryness in the mouth, an instinct to step back that had to be consciously overridden. I first noticed it on the night of October 25th, a Saturday. It came from the tree line north of camp, carried on the ridge wind that ran cold and steady down from the northeast, most nights at that elevation. It was faint enough that I might have dismissed it as something in the cook's supplies, except that it moved with the wind, and the wind shifted twice that night, and both times the smell followed it, which is to say, the smell had a source that was moving. I lay in my bedroll in the timber crew's long tent, and breathed it, and thought about Harmon Burl's 3-day rule, which we had not observed, and I thought about the prints at the base of the blazed trees, and I did not sleep particularly well. At breakfast the following morning, I discovered I had not been the only one awake. Doane mentioned the smell without ceremony, the way he mentioned everything, by describing it and then looking at Pruitt for a response. 2 other men at the table, a pair of fallers from McDowell County, whose names I will leave out, said they had smelled it also. Rue said he had smelled nothing but rain, and given Rue's tendency to anchor whatever he wanted to believe, I took that as evidence he had smelled it too, and was working to persuade himself otherwise. Pruitt said he had noticed an unusual odor, and supposed it might be from a mineral seep somewhere on the upper ridge. There were sulfur springs throughout the Guyandot watershed, and it was a reasonable supposition. I did not dispute it publicly. I noted it in the tally book as follows, and I am reading from memory since the book is no longer in my possession. October 26th, morning. Strong and localized odor, sulfur and organic, north tree line. Origin unknown. Second observation, 3 men independent. Wind source. Consider proximity to mineral seep. I wrote consider because I was not yet ready to write what I was actually thinking. The tally book was a company document, and I was a company man. That morning I went up the ridge to continue marking and found that 3 more of my blaze marks along the northeastern boundary had been cleared overnight. Again, no claw sign. Again, the bark returned to the tree surface in a way that required a pressure and a deliberateness I could not attribute to any animal I knew. And this time, besides the 4-toed prints, there was something additional in the clay. A long furrow, perhaps 8 inches wide and 2 inches deep, running parallel to the tree line for about 40 feet before it turned and went up the slope into the heavier timber. Not a drag mark, not a skid. More like the groove left by a heavy post being dragged on its end, except with occasional irregularities, suggesting something flexible rather than rigid. I measured it. I drew a rough sketch in the tally book margin. I reblazed the 3 cleared trees and then stood for a while in the gray morning quiet and tried to think clearly. Here is what I knew. Something large, heavy, and deliberate was moving along my marked boundary at night and removing the physical evidence of that boundary from the trees. It was leaving impressions that no animal I could name produced. It was producing a smell that preceded and followed it. And it was doing this selectively, removing boundary markers specifically, not touching the supply cache, not going near the horses, not disturbing the camp itself. It was removing the lines I had drawn. A timber cruiser who cannot hold his lines cannot do his job. That is not a small thing. In practical terms, removing the boundary markers meant that when the fallers followed my marks to determine where to cut, they would find no marks, or they would cut past where I had intended and potentially take timber the company had no rights to, or they would stop short and under-deliver on the contract. The markers were the job, and something, was removing them the night after I set them. There is one more thing I want to say clearly before I continue. I have spent 6 years trying to find a rational account for what happened on Bickmore Ridge. I have consulted with a naturalist at the State Normal School in Huntington. I have read what literature exists on large unidentified animal sightings in the Appalachian region. I have talked to other timbermen who worked the Upper Guyandotte country in the years before and after 1907. None of that has produced an explanation that accounts for all the observed facts simultaneously. I am not saying it was a supernatural creature. I am saying I do not have an explanation. I want that on record. The morning of October 27th was when Harmon Burl made his decision, and I want to describe what preceded it carefully, because it is the detail most people find difficult to believe, and it is the detail I am most certain about. At dusk on the 26th, the horses began to pull at their tethers. Not wildly, not in the frenzied way horses behave when there is fire nearby, or a predator has made direct contact. They pulled back slowly, leaning their weight against the lines, and their eyes showed white at the edges, and they breathed through their nostrils in a rapid, shallow way that Doan recognized before any of the rest of us did. He came out of the tent and walked to the horses without speaking, and stood with them for several minutes. Then he walked to the tree line north of camp, and stood at the edge of it looking into the dark between the trees, and came back and sat down at the fire, and did not say anything for a long time. The smell was stronger that night, strong enough that 2 of the fallers went outside briefly and came back inside making faces, strong enough that Stroud, who had said nothing about it previously, asked Doan whether there was a dead animal somewhere nearby. Doan said he did not think so. He said it in a way that meant something else entirely, but that none of us wanted to pursue. Harmon Burl rose from his place at the fire at around 7 in the evening and said he needed to walk to the east side of camp for a moment. He was gone 2 minutes, if that. He came back inside the tent and I watched his face, and what I saw there was not fear exactly. It was more the expression of a man who has confirmed something he already knew and is now calculating what to do with the information. He sat down. He looked at his brother. Cleet met his eyes briefly and then looked away. Harmon stood back up, went to his bedroll, folded it, packed his kit bag, and walked to the tent entrance. Pruitt asked him what he was doing. Harmon said, "My family's finished its seasons here, and I mean to keep it that way." Then he walked out of camp, down the logging road, into the dark, toward the valley, and that was the last I saw of Harmon Burl. He was gone before anyone thought to follow him, and Cleet remained, saying nothing, sitting with his coffee mug between both hands. Pruitt sent no one after him that night. Losing one local laborer was an irritant, not a crisis. But I watched Cleet's face for the rest of that evening, and what I saw was a man who was staying not because he was unafraid, but because he had decided to stay, despite knowing what his brother knew. And that specific kind of decision is one I have come to respect enormously in retrospect. The following morning, October 27th, Pruitt called a brief muster and announced that Harmon Burl had left the crew voluntarily and that the work would continue on schedule. He asked if anyone else had something to say. Nobody did, though Rue made a remark about superstitious hollow folk that I would have liked to address but did not. We went to our work. I was back on the upper ridge by 7:30. I had reblazed the 3 cleared trees for the 3rd time. I added a 4th mark, slightly inside the established line, as a test. If the 4th mark was cleared while the established 3 remained, it would tell me something about whether the clearing was random or boundary-specific. I noted this in the tally book and went on with the day's crew's work. By noon, I had assessed a section of yellow poplar along the southern slope that would have yielded perhaps 8,000 board feet on its own, some of the best timber I had seen in 6 years of cruising. I marked the largest trees with a different blaze pattern, a diamond shape rather than a simple strip, to indicate select timber for priority felling. I was thorough. I was doing the job I was paid to do. The afternoon light came down at the low October angle that turns everything amber and shadow, and I was working my way back along the northeastern boundary toward camp when I stopped. I was perhaps 150 yards from the tree line, at the upper edge of the cutover area, which was a section the crew had cleared 3 days earlier, stumps standing in gray rows, bark scraps and branch debris on the ground between them. The light was going, and at the far edge of the cutover, where the uncut timber began, there was a shape among the trees that had not been there when I had crossed that ground in the morning. It was white. Not the white of birch bark or the white of a dead tree. It was the white of an animal's coat, heavy and rough-surfaced, and it was large enough that my eyes initially refused to process it as an animal because the scale was wrong for anything I knew. I estimated later, comparing it to the trees it stood among, that it was at the shoulder roughly 5.5 to 6 feet, with a mass through the body that suggested something between a large draft horse and a black bear in terms of raw bulk, though the shape was neither. The head was large, blunt-nosed, set somewhat low on a heavy neck, and the legs were proportioned more like a large livestock animal than like a bear, wide-set and heavy-jointed. It was standing still. Completely still, in the way that large animals stand still when they are watching something. Not the stillness of an animal resting, but the focused stillness of an animal that has already identified what it is looking at and is making a decision. It was looking at me. I have been asked whether I ran. I did not. I want to be clear about what happened in my body in that moment, because it is relevant to what I did afterward. What happened was that everything slowed down, my breathing, my thought, my awareness of the cold and the fading light, and I became very aware of the exact position of my feet on the ground, and the weight of my cruising axe in my hand, and the distance between myself and the tree line. I did not run because running did not occur to me as an option. I was not operating at the level of decision. I was standing very still in the middle of the cutover, watching a white animal stand very still at the far edge of it, and both of us were doing the same thing, which was assessing. After what I believe was approximately 2 minutes, though it might have been less, the shape moved. Not toward me. It turned, slowly, and went into the trees, and the trees closed behind it, and I stood in the cutover, alone with the amber light failing and the smell rolling off the north wind like a wall. I will tell you what I felt, because you asked. I felt, very clearly and without any hysteria, that I had been studied and dismissed for the moment, not as prey, not as a threat, but as a problem that had been noted and that would be addressed in due course. That is the most accurate description I can produce. It was not a random sighting. That animal knew exactly where I had been all day. And I thought immediately of the blazed trees. I thought of them the way you think of something obvious that you should have understood sooner. I walked back to camp in the last of the light, and I was approximately halfway there when I understood, fully and completely, what had been happening since October 22nd. I had been drawing the lines for the harvest, and something that lived on that ridge had been removing them. Every blaze I cut, every boundary tree I marked, was a declaration. This ground belongs to us now. This ground will be altered. This ground is ours to take. And something that understood, whether by instinct or by intelligence of a kind I cannot categorize, that these marks were the advance notice of destruction, had been removing them, not attacking the camp, not taking the horses, not harming any man, removing the marks. The way you might remove a surveyor's stake from your property if someone planted it in the night without your permission. I sat with this understanding for the walk back to camp, and I turned it over several times, and I could not find a flaw in it. It fit every observed fact, the selectivity of which marks were cleared, the fact that the camp itself was untouched, the fact that when I placed a test mark inside the established line, only my 3 re-established boundary trees had been cleared and the inner test mark had been left alone, which told me it was not clearing marks randomly, but clearing marks that defined the boundary of the proposed cut. I had not yet had time to look at the test mark that afternoon, but I was already certain of what I would find. I reported all of this to Pruitt that evening, with the same clinical delivery I would use if I were reporting a problem with the skid road or a shortage in the supply chain. I described the shape I had seen at the tree line. I described its size, its color, its behavior. I described my analysis of the blaze clearing pattern. I laid my tally book on the table between us, opened to the entries, and I let him read them. Pruitt sat with this for a long while. He was not a man who rushed his responses, which was one of the things I respected about him. He read the entries twice. He did not say bear. That fact alone told me that something in what I had described had reached through his categories. He said he would organize a 3-man party to go up the ridge at first light and walk the boundary line and see for themselves. I said that was reasonable. I said I would go. He named Doan and Rue to come with me. I would have preferred Cleet Burl over Rue, but Rue was the strongest man on the crew, and Pruitt's instinct was always to put strength on a problem. I did not argue. That night, October 27th going into the 28th, was the worst night the camp had. The smell came in heavy before 9 in the evening, heavy enough to be noticed by every man in the tent without anyone needing to point it out, and this time it did not come and go with the wind shifts. It sat. It established itself like weather settling in. The horses pulled their tethers steadily for 2 hours, not frantically, just the persistent leaning of animals that want very badly to be somewhere else. And Doan went out twice and settled them, and both times they had begun pulling again within 20 minutes of him coming back inside. Shortly before midnight, something moved along the perimeter of the camp. I heard it as a sound, or rather as the suggestion of sound, the slight displacement of air through the undergrowth, the occasional soft creak of weight on frozen leaf litter, and the smell rolling in a wave ahead of it. It completed what I estimated as a full circuit of the camp perimeter in perhaps 15 minutes. It came no closer than the tree line. It touched nothing. When it had gone, the horses settled, and the smell thinned over the following half hour, and the camp went quiet. Nobody spoke in the tent during those 15 minutes. I was aware of breathing on all sides of me, of men awake and very still, listening, and I understood that the conversation about what to do next had shifted decisively without anyone saying a word. You can decide in advance that something is a bear. You cannot maintain that decision while it is walking around your camp in the dark smelling of sulfur and wool. At breakfast, nobody brought it up directly. This is one of the things about working men that I have always found instructive. They will not say the thing, but the thing has already been said, and everyone knows it. Stroud, the company man, asked Pruitt quietly at one point whether the contract allowed for force majeure. Pruitt told him to eat his breakfast. Ree said nothing about the night. He was subdued in a way I had not seen from him before, and he drank 2 cups of coffee where he normally drank 1, and he kept his back against the supply tent wall in a way that put something solid behind him. Cleet Burl sat at the end of the table and ate steadily, and watched the tent entrance, and I thought about his brother walking into the dark 4 nights ago, and wondered if the calculation Cleet was running in his head was the same one I was running in mine. We went up at first light, the 4 of us, myself, Doan, Rue, and Cleet Burl, who Pruitt substituted for Rue at the last minute after I went to him privately and made my case. I was grateful for that. Rue took it badly and stood in the camp, watching us go with the expression of a man who is relieved and insulted in equal parts. We went up the logging road to the first saddle, then off the road and up through the heavier timber on the northeastern slope. Doan moved with the same deliberate care as always, placing his feet precisely, reading the ground. Cleet moved ahead of me and slightly to the right, and I noticed he was reading the forest the way his brother had, with constant small shifts of attention, checking the trees at mid-height rather than the ground, which is the opposite of what most men do and which I filed away. We crossed the upper edge of the cut area, At around 7:30 in the morning, the fog was lying low over the stumps, thick enough that you could not see clearly more than 60 or 70 yards across the cleared ground. The fog was cold and still, and had a dampness that was not quite rain. I led the other three around the eastern edge of the cut, staying in the timber, moving toward the northeastern boundary, where I had done most of my marking work. I found the test mark first. The mark I had set inside the established line, in the location the established line marks had not been, was undisturbed. I showed it to Doan, who looked at it for a moment and then looked at me, and we did not exchange words, but I believe we understood each other. We moved along the boundary line toward the northeastern corner. 7 of the reblazed trees were cleared again. 7, on the same section of line, cleared for the 3rd time since October 22nd. The prints were fresh. The clay was barely set around the impressions, and the furrow I had noted before ran parallel to the line again, longer this time, perhaps 60 feet, with a different quality to the floor of it, a compressed regularity that looked almost deliberate. Cleet crouched over the furrow for a long time. Then he stood and said, without looking at any of us, "That's its tail." I want to say I was surprised. I was not. Something in the length and width and regularity of the furrow had already suggested it to me, the dragging impression of something long and heavy and semi-prehensile. I noted it in the tally book. We reached the corner of the northeastern boundary and started along the upper edge, heading toward the high point of the ridge. The fog was breaking in patches, thinning where the slope fell away to the southeast and holding thick in the low places between the timber stands. We were perhaps 40 yards inside the tree line above the cutover when Doan stopped. The smell had come back, not gradually, the way it moved at night, but suddenly, as if a door had been opened. It hit all 4 of us at the same instant, and I heard Ryu's sound, Cleet's sharp intake of breath, and felt my own body respond before my mind formed a thought about it. The horses, 400 yards below us, made a sound that carried up through the timber, and Doan turned his head toward it for a fraction of a second, and then turned back. We came out of the tree line at the upper edge of the cutover at the same moment, all 4 of us, because the timber gave way to cleared ground, and we were at the top of the cut, and the fog was thin here in the wind, and we stopped. It was standing at the far side of the cutover, at the tree line on the opposite edge, perhaps 40 yards away. Full daylight, grey and diffuse through the overcast, but sufficient, more than sufficient. I will describe what I saw. I will be complete, and I will be accurate, and I will not embellish. It stood on 4 legs, wide set, heavy through the joints, with hooves, not paws, not feet, hooves, which caught the grey light and were dark in color, like old iron. The body was massive, the depth of the chest greater than any cattle breed I have seen, covered in a coat of heavy fur or fleece, matted and coarse, white overall but stained yellow-gray along the lower legs and the underside, the staining of an animal that moved through clay and brush regularly. The neck was thick and short, set between shoulders that were notably high, giving it a slightly humped silhouette, and the head was broad and blunt, with a wide, flat face that sat forward on the neck rather than high on it. The ears were wide and low-set, like a sheep's ears but larger. The eyes were small and dark and set wide apart, and they were open and fixed and entirely still, which is perhaps the most difficult thing to describe accurately, because the stillness of those eyes was not the stillness of stupidity. It was the stillness of complete attention. It did not move when we appeared. It had been standing there before we came out of the trees. I have no doubt about that. It had been standing there waiting. We stopped walking at the same instant. I think none of us made a conscious decision to stop. We were simply stopped, the 4 of us in a row at the upper edge of the cutover, and the thing stood 40 yards across the clearing watching us, and none of us made a sound for a long time. I want to place on record precisely what I was thinking during those first several seconds, because I believe it is relevant. I was thinking about the blazed trees, about the fact that I had remarked those trees 3 times, and that every time, within one night, the marks had been removed. And I was thinking about the fact that this animal, whatever it was, standing 40 yards away in the grey morning light, had spent 6 nights walking my boundary line and removing evidence of it, had not touched a man or a horse, had not approached the camp except to circle it once and leave, and was now standing in front of us with the same settled completeness of purpose as a farmer standing at a fence line with his hand on the top rail, waiting for a conversation. Doan said nothing. Cleet said nothing. Ryu, to his credit and without any of the confidence he normally carried, said, "What do we do?" It was not a question he expected anyone to answer, but it is the question that the moment required. Here is where my agency entered the situation, and here is where I must be honest about a choice I made, that I am not entirely certain was the right one, though I believe it was. I had a length of red flagging tape in my coat pocket. Surveyor's tape, the kind I used to mark trees between cruising sessions as a temporary indicator before I came back with the axe to make a proper blaze. I had been carrying it out of habit. I took it out of my pocket. I held it up so that it was visible, the bright red strip against the grey morning air. Then I crouched down and I pressed the tape flat against the ground, flat against the clay of the cut-over floor, and I smoothed it with my hand, and I stood up empty-handed. I do not know why I did this. I have thought about it many times since. The most honest thing I can say is that it was an acknowledgement. I had been placing marks on this ridge. I was removing a mark in front of the thing that had been removing marks. Whether it understood that the way I understood it, I cannot say, but it was what I had. The creature stood for another interval after that, perhaps a minute. Then it turned, in the deliberate way a large animal turns when it has decided something and is not concerned about being watched while it does it, and it walked back into the trees, not running, walking, and the trees took it, and it was gone. We stood in the cutover for another minute. Then we walked back down the ridge. We did not speak on the way down, not because we were afraid, or not only because of that, but because there was nothing to say that the morning had not already said more clearly than any of us were capable of saying it. I will tell you now about the thing I noticed on that walk that I did not say aloud at the time, because I have been working out whether to include it in this account, and I have decided that leaving it out would be a form of dishonesty. When we came back through the northeastern boundary section, I looked at the 7 cleared trees again as we passed, and I noticed something I had not noticed before, perhaps because I had always been approaching from the other direction, or perhaps because I had simply not been looking for it. Each tree that had been cleared, the bark pressed back over the blaze, had a mark of its own, at approximately chest height, on the side facing away from my blazes. A series of lateral indentations, shallow, regular, arranged in groups of 3, pressed into the outer bark, but not penetrating to the wood. Not carved, pressed. Each group of 3 indentations at approximately the same height on each tree. They looked, and I am aware of how this sounds and I am recording it anyway, they looked like notation, like marks made by something that was also keeping count. I wrote this in the tally book on the walk down, and my handwriting on that page is different from my normal handwriting, more deliberate. The letters pressed heavier into the page. I have noticed this before in accounts I have taken in the field, when something happened that the body recognized before the mind was ready to classify it. We reached camp at 9:15. Pruitt was waiting. He had read the men well enough that morning to know something had changed, and he watched our faces as we came in from the logging road, and he said nothing until we had all sat down and I had opened the tally book on the table in front of him. I told him what we had seen, all of it, the size of the animal, its coat, its bearing, the prints, the tail furrow, the marks on the trees facing away from my blazes, the moment in the cutover, the red tape. I described all of it in the same voice, and at the same pace I would use to describe a timber assessment, because the situation required clarity, and clarity required that I not modulate my voice around the parts that were more difficult to say. When I finished, Pruitt was quiet for a long time. He looked at the tally book without reading it. He looked at Doan, who met his eyes briefly and then looked at the tent wall. He looked at Cleet Burl, who was sitting with his hands around his coffee mug, and who said, without being asked, that there were 40 years of stories in his family about what lived on the upper ridge, and that in none of those stories did anyone who finished their season do so by staying past the point when it showed itself in the daylight. Pruitt asked him what happened to those who stayed. Cleet thought about it. He said they stopped having stories to tell. Stroud, the company man, had been sitting at the far end of the table throughout this conversation, and I had forgotten he was there until he spoke. He asked, in a voice that was admirably controlled, given that he had been on that ridge when the thing circled the camp, whether he was understanding correctly that the entire crew was proposing to abandon the contract. He did not say it as a challenge. He said it as a man who needs the situation to be clearly stated so he can begin working out what it means for his ledger. I said yes. Pruitt looked at me for a moment and then said, "You're the cruiser. You've seen it twice." I said I had. He said, "And you're telling me to pull the crew?" I said I was not telling him to do anything. I was describing what we had observed and what I assessed the situation to be, which was that the upper ridge had a resident animal of unknown species that was systematically removing the boundary markers of the harvest operation with what appeared to be specific intent. That it had demonstrated the capacity to circle the camp at night and observe the crew closely without being detected or deterred, that it had presented itself in open daylight to a four-man party in a manner consistent with a territorial warning, and that in my professional judgment, continuing to mark trees on that ridge would continue to provoke a response of escalating proximity. I said one more thing. I said, 3 days of our marks is all it left standing. We've been reblazing the same 7 trees for 6 days. If it had wanted to do something other than remove the marks, it would have done it by now. But I don't know that that is permanent. There was a silence after that. Pruitt asked if any man in the camp would not go back up the ridge. He meant it as a leadership question, the kind of question that expects the answer to be that the men will follow where the foreman goes. What he got was a different answer. Every man declined, in various ways, with various explanations, but every man. The 2 McDowell County Fallers said they had worked timber for 17 years and had not survived it by ignoring a warning when it showed itself in the open. Stroud said, with remarkable composure, that he was a record keeper and not a faller, and that his value to the company was in returning with accurate accounts of what had occurred, not in maximizing the board-foot yield of a single contract. Doan said, simply and without elaboration, that the horses would not go up again. And Cleet Burl said he had decided to follow his brother. Pruitt sat with all of this. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the camp itself went quiet around him. Then he said something that I have held on to for 6 years, not because it was philosophical or dramatic, but because it was the most honest thing I ever heard Aldous Pruitt say. He said, "I have run timber in this country since before most of you were working age, and I have never broken a contract, and I have never pulled a crew without reason, and I want it on record that I believe there is reason here." And then he said, "I am not going to order any of you back up that ridge." That was the end of the vote. Stroud recorded it in his own ledger with the heading Notice of Crew Withdrawal and the date October 28, 1907, and the phrase reason of force, which is the language timber contracts used for conditions that made continued work impossible. Force, in this case, being something other than weather. I spent the next 2 hours completing the tally book entry for the contracted area, calculating the board feet I had assessed, noting which sections were cruised and which were not, and writing a final summary of the boundary marking work. This entry is dated November 3rd, in the account I gave to the Glenwood Field Superintendent, though in fact I wrote it on the 28th. I changed the date because the contract required cruise completion by November 3rd, and I wanted the record to be as clean as possible for the men who would need it to argue the force clause. I am telling you the truth of it now. The final entry in the tally book, which I wrote on the morning of October 28th before we broke camp, ends mid-sentence. I was recording the estimated board feet on the southern slope section when Pruitt called for us to start loading the wagons, and I closed the book with the entry incomplete. The pencil line runs off the right edge of the page, which is what happens when you close a tally book on a page that is still being written. I surrendered the tally book to the Glenwood Field Superintendent at the company office in Charleston on November 6, 1907. He reviewed it and noted the final entry and asked me why the cruise summary was incomplete. I told him we had left the site before I finished writing. He asked why we had left. I gave him the same account I have given you, more briefly, and he looked at me for a moment and then wrote something in his own ledger and said the force clause submission would be reviewed by the company's legal office. The penalty clause in the contract specified a recovery of 30% of the contracted labor cost from the crew's wages in the event of withdrawal without completion. Glenwood exercised the clause. 16 men took a 30% cut on their season wages. For most of them, that was the difference between a comfortable winter and a difficult one. For a few of the younger men with families in the hollow towns, it was harder than that. Not a single man filed a complaint. Not one. I have thought about what that means. 16 men accepted a penalty clause that cost them real money without protest, because the alternative was returning to Bickmore Ridge, and not one of them was willing to do that. That says something. I am not certain what it says, but it says something. Pruitt stayed. I want to come back to this, because I committed earlier to accounting for it fully. When the wagons moved on the morning of October 28th, Aldous Pruitt was standing in the camp with his kit on the ground beside him. He said he needed to walk the ridge one more time and satisfy himself about what we had seen. He said it in the voice of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is informing rather than consulting. No one argued with him. I think several of us recognized that argument would not have reached him at that point. He had run timber for 20 years without breaking a contract, and something in him could not leave that ridge without going back up it at least once, even if he could not explain to himself or to anyone else what he expected to find there. We left him. I am not going to dress that up. We left him standing in the empty camp with his kit bag and his 20 years of timber experience, and whatever internal argument he was having with himself about what was reasonable and what was not, and we took the wagons down the logging road and into the valley and left. He came down 3 days later, November 1st, according to Stroud's records. He walked into the valley floor settlement at Pinnacle Creek in the mid-afternoon, without his hat, without his kit bag, and without any observable injury. The settlement postmaster's wife gave him water and asked him what had happened, and he told her he had been camping on the ridge and was done with it now. He walked to the road and caught a ride on a freight wagon toward the railroad station. I never saw Pruitt again after the morning of October 28th, when we left him in the camp. What I know of his 3 days on the ridge comes from a letter that Doane received from him in the spring of 1908, which Doane showed me once and which I read carefully. In the letter, Pruitt said he had gone back up the ridge on the morning of October 29th and had spent half a day walking the boundary line. He said every blaze mark, all of them, including the marks I had not yet cleared, had been removed. All of them. The entire boundary, 60-some marked trees, cleared overnight. He said the camp had also been partially dismantled, not destroyed, but rearranged in a way that suggested inspection rather than vandalism. Equipment moved to the center of the clearing, the cook tent's side wall folded back. He said he had seen the creature twice in those 3 days, once at the edge of the cutover at a distance of perhaps 100 yards, and once, on the second night, at the edge of the camp itself, standing in the firelight at a range of perhaps 20 feet, while Pruitt sat on his kit bag and looked back at it. He wrote that he sat with it for what felt like a long time, and that it looked at him in the way you look at something you have made up your mind about. Then it turned and walked up the ridge, and he did not see it again. He came down the following morning. In the letter, Pruitt did not use the word Squatch or any other name. He described it only as the white animal on the ridge. He said he had returned to Greenbrier County and was working a small farm his cousin owned. He said he had no plans to return to the timber business. He ended the letter by saying, and this is as close as I can reproduce it from memory 6 years later, "I have worked timber long enough to know when a stand is not mine to take. I knew it on the ridge, and I am not ashamed to have taken 3 days to know it fully." Doane folded the letter and put it back in his coat and said nothing, and that was the last time either of us discussed Pruitt. I want to return to the tally book now, because it is the artifact at the center of this account, and Mr. Fitch asked me specifically about it, and I promised to account for its whereabouts. The book was surrendered to the Glenwood Field Superintendent in November of 1907, as I described. The superintendent kept it as part of the inquiry file on the Bickmore Ridge contract. The file was reviewed by the company's legal office when the force clause was challenged, briefly and without success, by one of the McDowell County fallers who needed the 30% and believed he had grounds. The legal office closed the file in January of 1908. I do not know what became of the file after that. The Glenwood Timber and Stave Company was acquired by a larger Charleston concern in 1910, and I do not know what was done with the acquired company's records. I have made inquiries and have not located the tally book. I do not have physical evidence of any of what I have described. The measurements in the tally book, the sketches of the prints and the furrow, the final incomplete entry with the pencil line trailing off the page, the note about the indentations on the back faces of the cleared trees, none of it is accessible to me. I am telling you what I recorded, from memory, 6 years after the fact. I understand that this is the weakest possible form of evidence. What I have told Mr. Fitch, and what I am saying now for whatever record this account becomes part of, is that I am not asking to be believed. I am describing what happened. A timber cruiser's job is observation and documentation, and I documented what I observed. Whether the documentation survives is not within my control. There is one more thing I want to address before I close, because I think it is the most important thing, and because I think leaving it unsaid would make this account less complete than I intend it to be. The creature on Bickmore Ridge did not hurt anyone. Not one man on that crew was touched. Not one horse was harmed. The camp was not destroyed. The equipment was not damaged. If you step back from the experience of being inside it, which is an experience that I do not wish to minimize because the smell alone and the sound of it circling in the dark were enough to make grown men lie awake sweating in November cold, what actually happened is this. A large animal that had been living on that ridge removed our boundary markers every night we set them, showed itself to a 4-man party in a manner that made its territorial claim unambiguous, and continued to remove the markers until we left. It did not fight us. It evicted us. I was a timber cruiser. I drew lines. My entire job was the declaration of ownership and the advance notice of harvest, and what was on that ridge looked at those declarations and did what any occupant of contested ground does when someone else's survey stakes appear on their land. I am not drawing a moral from this. I am a man who works with measurements and board feet and property assessments, not a philosopher. But I will say that if I were marking timber boundaries today, and if I found a section where the marks were being removed as fast as I set them, my professional response would be the same as it was in 1907. Leave the section alone. I bought a copy of Harmon Burrell's rule eventually. Not through any supernatural conviction, but because the rule works. If you place a mark and something removes it, the appropriate response is to note the removal, assess the situation, and find a different section. I have worked in property assessment for 6 years now. I no longer draw lines in forests. My lines are on paper, in registers, in deed books, in records that go in file cabinets in county buildings. And nothing from the upper reaches of any West Virginia ridge comes down to the county clerk's office to remove them. This suits me. Bickmore Ridge was recontracted by Glenwood's successor company in 1911 with a different crew and a different cruiser. I know this from the county deed records, which are part of my work. The 1911 contract was also abandoned, the record notes, due to adverse conditions. The timber on the upper ridge was never harvested. It may still be standing. I find I have no particular feeling about that either way. The smell, if you are asking, does not persist, by which I mean I do not smell it in memory on ordinary days, which is the thing people usually want to know when they hear an account like this. But there are mornings in November, when the first cold comes down from the high ground, and the air has that particular combination of wet leaves and mineral frost, when something in the back of my nose registers a quality to the air that I recognize, and on those mornings I drink my coffee inside rather than on the front step. That is a practical adjustment, not a haunting. I am a man who makes practical adjustments. The ridge is still up there, 62,000 board feet of unharvested hardwood, by my final estimate, probably more than that by now, 16 years of additional growth. A stand worth a great deal to a timber company willing to make the investment. Perhaps one day someone will find a way to work it without drawing lines that need to stay drawn. Perhaps not. I have told you what I know. I have not speculated beyond my observations. I have accounted for every fact in my possession, including the facts I cannot prove, and the facts that reflect poorly on my own certainty about the world. You may do with it what you think is appropriate. I trust Mr. Fitch's judgment about what is worth preserving, and I hold no expectation about how it will be received. That is the account.